In a big house on the edge of town lived a family that everyone admired. Their home was large, bright, and always filled with the sound of laughter. Guests came often, neighbors, friends, and business people. The evenings were full of chatter, music, and clinking glasses. Everything seemed perfect from the outside. Among the quiet workers in that house was a maid who had joined only a few months earlier. She was polite, gentle, and always moved with care, making sure every glass was clean and every cushion was in its right place. She didn't speak much. Her presence was calm, almost invisible, as if she had learned to blend into the background. Every morning she would start her day before sunrise. She would sweep the long hallways, polish the wooden floors until they shone, and prepare the breakfast table before anyone else woke up. She did her work with full attention, never complaining, never asking for anything extra. The family liked her quiet nature. They often said she was the kind of help every household wished for, someone who simply did her job and didn't create noise. She was grateful for the work, but deep down, she carried something that no one in that house knew. Sometimes when she passed through the main hall, her eyes would stop at the grand piano that stood near the tall window. It was beautiful, its black surface shining under the soft morning light. The instrument was old but well cared for, and it seemed to hold secrets of its own. She would glance at it for a few seconds, then quickly look away and continue with her chores. No one noticed the way she looked at it. To others, it was just another piece of furniture. But to her, it was something else. Something that brought back memories she tried hard to forget. Every now and then, when no one was around, she would slow her steps near it. Her fingers would twitch slightly, as if remembering how it felt to touch the cool keys, but she never dared to play, not even a single note. The evenings were always lively. The family hosted many gatherings, especially on weekends. Guests filled the living room with stories, jokes, and laughter. Someone would always ask one of the guests to play the piano, and the sound of cheerful melodies would float through the house. She would stand quietly in the corner, serving drinks or collecting empty glasses, pretending not to listen, but her heart would beat faster with every tune. One night, as a guest played a slow song, she stopped near the kitchen door and closed her eyes. Her hands holding a tray moved slightly with the rhythm. For a moment she forgot she was a maid. She was just a woman listening to something she once loved deeply. Then a voice called her name, snapping her back to reality. She quickly opened her eyes, smiled faintly, and returned to her work. No one in the family ever asked about her life before she came there. To them, she was simply a worker. But behind her quiet smile was a story that few could imagine. A story of dreams, loss, and unfinished music. There were times at night, after everyone went to bed, when she would walk through the empty living room to make sure everything was clean. The piano would be there, sitting silently in the dark. She would stand near it, her reflection faint on the glossy surface. Slowly, she would lift her hand, almost touching the keys, but then she would pull back. Afraid someone might hear, she would whisper softly, "Not now," and turn off the last light before leaving the room. Days passed, and her life continued in the same quiet rhythm, work, rest, and more work. But inside her, something was changing. Every time she saw the piano, the longing grew stronger. It wasn't just about playing, it was about remembering who she used to be before life forced her to start over. Once, while cleaning the bookshelf near the piano, she found an old sheet of music tucked between two heavy books. It was yellowed and dusty, but she could still read the notes. She stared at it for a long moment, tracing the lines with her finger. The memory of her childhood came flooding back. The sound of her mother's voice, the wooden piano in their small home, the afternoons spent practicing until the sun went down. She quickly put the paper back and wiped her eyes before anyone noticed. The family's children, polite but curious, sometimes asked her small questions. "Do you like music?" One of them asked once, seeing her pause near the piano. She smiled and said quietly, "Yes, music is beautiful." Then she went back to cleaning. The child didn't think much of it, but the look in her eyes said more than her words ever could. One afternoon, when the family was out, she finished her work earlier than usual. The house was empty and silent. Only the ticking clock could be heard. She walked slowly toward the piano, her heart pounding. Her hands trembled as she lifted the cover from the keys. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring. Then, unable to stop herself, she pressed a single key. The soft sound filled the air. It was shaky at first, uncertain but still beautiful. Her eyes widened as if she had just awakened from a long sleep. She sat down and let her fingers find their place. The notes that followed were gentle and slow but filled with deep feeling. She played quietly, afraid someone might walk in, but at that moment she didn't care. The years of silence melted away as the music returned to her hands. Her heart swelled with emotions she hadn't felt in so long. Sadness, joy, relief. When she finished, she let out a shaky breath and smiled through tears. But before she could play again, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She jumped up, quickly closing the piano cover and stepping aside just as one of the family members entered. They smiled at her, not noticing anything unusual, and asked for some tea. She nodded quickly and went to the kitchen, her heart still racing. That night, lying on her small bed, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the piano still echoed in her ears. She realized she had been hiding a part of herself for far too long. But now that part had woken up again. The next few days she worked as usual, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she saw the piano, she remembered that short moment when she had dared to play again. It made her both happy and afraid. One evening, as guests arrived for another dinner party, she caught a few of them joking near the piano. "This piano sits here for decoration," one of them laughed. "I bet even the maid could play it better than any of us." Everyone laughed. She was nearby, holding a tray of glasses. She smiled faintly but said nothing. Inside, she felt a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. If only they knew. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, but her heart was pounding again. That single moment of laughter planted a tiny seed in her mind, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, it was time for the truth to be heard. She didn't know it yet, but that small comment said in jest was about to change everything in her life. That night was colder than usual. The wind outside brushed against the windows, making a soft whistling sound. Inside, the house was alive with laughter again. The family was hosting another dinner, this time for some important guests. The dining table sparkled with silverware and candles, and the smell of roasted food filled the air. Everyone looked their best, dressed neatly and smiling brightly. The maid moved quietly around the room, serving food, refilling glasses, and clearing plates without drawing attention. Her steps were light, her face calm, her eyes lowered. To most people there, she was invisible, just another worker doing her duty. As the dinner went on, the conversation grew louder and more playful. The guests were in high spirits, talking about business, vacations, and music. One of them, after a few drinks, pointed toward the piano and said with a laugh, "That piano hasn't been played all night. Come on, someone show us some music." Another guest, slightly older, chuckled and replied, "I tried last time, but I forgot half the notes. I think even the maid could do better." The group burst into laughter. Even the host smiled politely, not wanting to spoil the mood. The maid, standing by the side with a tray, froze for a second. Her face didn't change, but inside, her chest tightened. The lady of the house, kind but slightly embarrassed, waved her hand and said softly, "Oh, don't tease her like that. She's busy working." The guests laughed again and changed the topic. But the maid had heard every word. She lowered her eyes, pretending not to care, but something inside her stirred. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, a mix of pain and longing. All evening, the piano seemed to catch her eye again and again. Every time someone walked past it or made a joke about music, she felt a strange pull. After dinner, the guests moved into the living room, holding cups of coffee and laughing at old stories. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and the soft golden light made everything feel warm. One guest began to play a simple tune on the piano, but it was clumsy and uneven. People laughed good-naturedly, teasing him about his playing. The maid stood nearby, quietly picking up empty cups. As she passed by, she could see his fingers pressing the wrong keys. Without thinking, her own fingers twitched as if they wanted to correct him. She quickly turned away before anyone noticed. But one person did notice. The lady of the house, sitting on the sofa, saw the way the maid's eyes had lingered on the piano keys. There was something different in that look, something she hadn't seen before. Later that night, when the guests were preparing to leave, the lady went into the kitchen. The maid was washing dishes, her hands moving in slow circles in the warm water. The sound of laughter still came faintly from the other room. The lady leaned on the counter and smiled gently. "You looked at the piano earlier," she said quietly. The maid froze for a moment, unsure how to answer. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice soft. "I didn't mean to." It's just a beautiful piano. Do you play? The lady asked. The maid looked down at her hands. I used to, she said after a pause. A long time ago. There was silence for a moment, just the sound of the water running. Then the lady said kindly, You should play again sometime. Maybe when everyone's gone. I'd like to hear it. The maid shook her head quickly. Oh no, I couldn't. I haven't played in years. I wouldn't remember much. The lady smiled again. Still, I think you should. Music doesn't forget that easily. The maid didn't answer, but those words stayed with her long after she went to bed that night. She lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the piano. She remembered her childhood, the small music school she once attended, her teacher's soft voice, the smell of old wood and sheet music. She remembered her parents saving money so she could take lessons even when things were hard. The piano had once been her world, but life had changed. Her family faced hard times and she had to give up her dreams. She had promised herself she would play again someday, but that day never came. Now lying in the quiet darkness, she wondered if it was too late. The next morning, the house was peaceful. The guests had gone and only the family remained. After breakfast, the lady called her into the living room. The maid wiped her hands nervously and stepped inside. The piano gleamed in the sunlight that came through the tall window. The lady was standing beside it. Would you like to try? She asked softly. The maid looked at her in surprise. Now? Just for a moment, the lady said. No one else is here. The maid hesitated. Her heart began to beat faster. She felt both fear and excitement. Slowly, she walked closer to the piano. It looked even larger up close, almost intimidating. She touched the edge of the piano with trembling fingers. The smooth wood felt warm under her hand. Then she sat down. For a few seconds, she didn't move. Take your time, the lady said kindly. The maid closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and placed her fingers on the keys. The first sound was hesitant, almost unsure. The note lingered softly in the air. Then she pressed another and another until the melody began to take shape. At first, she stumbled. Her fingers were stiff and she had forgotten the patterns. But as the moments passed, her hands began to remember. Her body remembered. The music started to flow again, soft, emotional, and full of something real. The lady stood quietly, her eyes wide with amazement. The maid's playing was gentle yet powerful. Each note carried emotion, like a story being told without words. When she finally stopped, the room was silent. The lady took a slow breath and said, That was beautiful. The maid's eyes filled with tears. I didn't think I could still play, she whispered. You never lost it, the lady said softly. You just stopped believing you could. The maid smiled faintly and wiped her eyes. Thank you, she said quietly, for letting me play. From that day, something changed between them. The lady began to treat her differently, not just as a worker, but as someone special, someone with a gift. She never spoke about it to the others, but her eyes held a quiet respect whenever they met. The maid, too, felt something new inside her. Every time she walked past the piano now, she didn't look away. She didn't touch it, but she let her gaze linger for a little longer, her heart lighter than before. A week later, another evening gathering was planned. The guests returned, some of the same faces who had laughed before. They filled the house with noise and excitement once again. As the maid moved between the tables, she heard one of the guests joke again. So did your maid practice her piano yet? He said with a laugh. Maybe she'll play for us tonight. Everyone laughed again, but this time the lady of the house smiled quietly instead of waving it off. Maybe she will, she said. The room went silent for a moment. The maid froze where she stood. Her heart raced as all eyes turned toward her. She tried to smile, unsure what to do. The lady's gentle eyes met hers across the room, silently encouraging her. The maid hesitated, clutching the tray in her hands. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock, the crackling of the fire, and the sound of her own breath. Would you like to? The lady asked softly. The maid looked down, nervous. I don't know if I can. Just one song, the lady said. No one will laugh this time. The maid glanced around. Some of the guests smiled politely, expecting a small amusement. They didn't believe she could really play, but she walked slowly toward the piano anyway. Her steps were uncertain, her heart pounding louder than ever. As she sat down, the room grew quiet. Everyone waited. No one knew what to expect. She placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. What happened next would silence the room and change her life forever. The room was filled with a strange kind of silence, the kind that holds a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Everyone's eyes were fixed on her as she sat at the piano. The maid, who had always moved quietly in the background, was now sitting in the brightest spot of the room. The golden light from the chandelier fell softly on her hands resting above the keys. For a moment, she didn't move. She could feel her heartbeat echoing in her chest. Her palms were slightly sweaty, and her fingers trembled just a little. She wasn't used to being watched, especially not by people dressed in silk and suits. She could sense a few smiles around the room, some curious, some amused. The lady of the house gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "You can do this." That gentle look gave her the courage she needed. She took a deep breath and pressed the first key. The sound that came out was soft but clear. Then another note followed, then another, until the room was no longer silent. It was filled with music. At first, the melody was slow, uncertain, like a bird testing its wings after a long time. But soon her fingers began to remember. The hesitation faded, and the music started to flow like a quiet river. The notes danced through the air, blending into a tune that carried emotion and warmth. The guests stopped whispering. Their smiles faded, not because they were unhappy, but because they were stunned. They hadn't expected this. They had thought it would be a simple joke, a moment of amusement. But what they were hearing was something entirely different. The maid's hands moved smoothly across the piano, her fingers finding each note with a kind of grace that could only come from years of love for the instrument. Her eyes closed as she played, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the maid in a rich household. She was a musician, lost in her world. The melody she played was something she had written long ago, back when her life was simpler. It was full of memories, of her childhood home, her parents' smiles, and the sound of rain hitting the roof. Each note carried a piece of her story. When she reached the higher notes, the room seemed to brighten. When she slowed down, it felt like time itself was holding its breath. Every person there was drawn into the emotion of her music. The man who had made the joke earlier looked down, his face red. The laughter that once filled the room had been replaced by quiet awe. Even the children, who were usually restless, sat still, their eyes wide. As the last part of the melody came, her hands slowed, and the notes softened until they faded into silence. For a moment, there was no sound at all. The maid kept her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling gently. Then slowly, the sound of clapping began, soft at first, then louder, until the entire room was filled with applause. She opened her eyes, startled. The same people who had laughed at her before were now standing, clapping, cheering. Some even had tears in their eyes. The lady of the house smiled proudly, her eyes shining. She stepped forward and said softly, "You see? I told you she could play." The maid stood up quickly, embarrassed by the attention. She bowed her head and whispered, "Thank you." One of the guests stepped forward, still clapping. "That was incredible," he said. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She looked at him shyly. "I used to learn when I was younger," she said quietly. Before I had to stop, another guest said with wonder, "You play with such feeling. It's not just skill, it's something from the heart." The maid smiled faintly. "Music always comes from the heart," she said simply. For a long time, people kept talking about her performance. They wanted to know more, to understand how someone so quiet could carry such beauty inside her. But she didn't say much. She just smiled and went back to her work, her hands still slightly shaking from the emotions. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, the lady found her cleaning the living room. The piano still stood in the corner, the faint light from the fireplace reflecting off its polished surface. The lady placed a hand on her shoulder and said softly, "You were wonderful tonight. I'm so proud of you." The maid smiled, her eyes watery. "I didn't think I could still do it," she said. "When I sat there, I thought my hands would fail me, but then it felt like everything came back." "It never really left you," the lady said kindly. "Some things just wait quietly until we're ready for them again." The maid looked at the piano, her face full of emotion. "When I played, I felt like I was back home," she whispered. "For a few minutes, I wasn't cleaning floors or serving tea. I was just me again." The lady nodded, understanding more than words could express. "And you should never forget that part of you," she said. "It's beautiful." For the first time in years, the maid went to sleep that night with a smile on her face. Her heart was light and her dreams were filled with music. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. When the guests had left the night before, one of them, a man who managed a local art center, had spoken to the lady privately. He had been deeply moved by the maid's performance. He told the lady that he wanted to invite her to play at a small charity event in the city. At first, the lady wasn't sure how to bring it up. She knew how shy and humble the maid was, but she also knew how much it could mean for her. So after breakfast, she gently approached her in the kitchen. "You played beautifully last night," she began. The maid blushed. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm happy everyone liked it." The lady smiled. "They didn't just like it, they loved it. One of the guests runs an art center. He asked if you would be willing to play at their charity event next month." The maid froze, almost dropping the cup she was holding. "Play in front of people?" she asked, her voice shaky. The lady nodded. "Yes, but it's a small gathering. Nothing fancy. They just want you to share your music." She looked down, unsure. "I don't know if I could. I'm not a real musician anymore." The lady placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You are," she said firmly. "You just forgot it for a while." For a long moment, the maid said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the window, where the morning sun was streaming in. Then she took a slow breath and whispered, "Maybe I can try." The lady smiled warmly. "That's all you need to do. Try." From that day, everything in the house felt a little different. The maid still did her chores, but there was a quiet joy in her movements now. In her free moments, she would sit at the piano and practice softly, her fingers moving with growing confidence. Sometimes the lady would listen from the hallway, smiling. The sound of her music filled the house, not as background noise, but as something alive, something that carried warmth into every corner. One evening, as she practiced alone, she paused for a moment and looked around the room. The same piano that once made her feel small now felt like her friend again. She placed her hands back on the keys and began to play a song she hadn't touched in years. This time it wasn't just for others, it was for herself. Outside, the sky turned golden as the sun began to set. The notes floated out the window, carried gently by the breeze. Reaching beyond the house and out into the quiet streets, she smiled softly as she played, unaware that her journey, the one that began with laughter, was only just beginning. The days that followed were full of quiet excitement. The maid continued her usual work, but something inside her had changed. There was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Each morning after finishing her chores, she would sit at the piano for a few minutes, letting her fingers dance gently across the keys. The sound was soft, like a whisper, but it filled the house with warmth. The lady of the house often watched from a distance, smiling to herself. She could see how the maid came alive when she played. The way her shoulders relaxed, the way her eyes softened. It was as if she became a different person altogether. The charity event was just a few weeks away. The lady had told her there would only be a small audience, some local teachers, artists, and a few families. But to the maid, even the thought of playing in front of strangers made her nervous. It had been years since she performed anywhere. At night, when everyone was asleep, she would sit alone in her small room and whisper to herself, "You can do it." But her heart still filled with doubt. One afternoon, while dusting the piano, she stopped and looked at her reflection in its shiny surface. Her face looked older than she remembered, her hands rough from years of work. "I'm not who I was," she whispered. "But maybe that's okay." She sat down and began to play again. This time she didn't try to be perfect. She just let her feelings guide her. The melody that came out was full of emotion, gentle, deep, and honest. It was the sound of someone who had lived through struggle and still found beauty in life. The lady entered quietly and listened from behind. When the song ended, she said softly, "That's the song you should play at the event." The maid turned, startled. "You think so?" "Yes," the lady replied with a kind smile. "It's real. People don't need perfect music, they need to feel something. And you make people feel." The maid lowered her eyes shyly. "I'll try my best." As the day of the event came closer, she practiced whenever she could. The other workers sometimes teased her playfully, saying the piano missed her whenever she stopped. She would laugh lightly, though deep inside her heart was heavy with fear and hope all at once. Finally, the morning of the event arrived. The sky was clear and the city felt alive. The lady drove her to the art center, a small but beautiful building with a stage and rows of chairs. The maid's hands shook slightly as she looked around. "I don't belong here," she whispered. The lady touched her shoulder gently. "You do. You've earned this." As they entered, a few people smiled and greeted them politely, unaware that the quiet woman in simple clothes was the evening's performer. The hall smelled faintly of flowers and polished wood. She could hear faint notes from someone testing another instrument. When her name was announced later that evening, she froze for a second. The lights were dimmed and a soft hush fell over the room. She walked slowly to the piano, her heart pounding in her chest. The audience watched curiously. Some expected a professional pianist. Others simply waited politely, not knowing what to expect. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys. The silence stretched. For a moment she thought about standing up and walking away. But then she remembered the lady's words, "People need to feel something." She took a slow breath, closed her eyes, and began to play. The first few notes floated through the air like gentle rain. The melody was slow, steady, and full of feeling. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Every note carried a piece of her heart. The music spoke of her journey, the quiet struggles, the lost dreams, and the rediscovery of hope. The audience grew still. A few leaned forward, their expressions softening. The more she played, the more her fear melted away. She was no longer performing for others, she was speaking through her music. As her fingers moved gracefully across the keys, flashes of her past came to her mind. The small house where she had first learned to play. Her teacher's kind smile. The day she had to stop because life became too hard. And then, the first time she dared to touch the piano again in this house. Each memory seemed to blend into the music itself. When the final note faded, the room remained silent for a moment. It was as if everyone needed time to breathe again. Then slowly, applause began. It started softly, then grew louder until the entire hall echoed with it. She looked up, eyes wide. Some people were standing, clapping with tears in their eyes. The lady was in the front row, smiling proudly, her eyes glistening. The maid stood up, her hands trembling slightly, and bowed her head. "Thank you," she said softly. After the event ended, many people came to her, thanking her for the performance. A few said her music reminded them of home, of lost loved ones, of things they hadn't thought about in years. She listened quietly, unable to find words. One of the organizers approached her with a warm smile. "You have a rare gift," he said. "You don't just play, you make people feel. Would you ever consider teaching or performing again?" She shook her head gently. "I'm just happy I could play tonight," she said. "That's enough for me." But deep down, something inside her had changed forever. On the way back home, the lady drove in silence for a while, then said softly, "You see what you did? You made people cry, laugh, remember. That's something only real artists can do." The maid looked out the window at the quiet streets passing by. "I never thought my music could still mean something," she whispered. "It always did," the lady said with a smile. "You just had to let the world hear it." When they reached home, the maid stood in front of the house for a moment, staring at the piano through the window. The same instrument that once made her feel small had now given her a voice again. Over the next few days, she noticed how people in the neighborhood began to recognize her. Some would stop by the gate and ask about her music. Others simply smiled kindly when they saw her walking to the market. She wasn't used to attention, but she accepted it with quiet grace. At home, the piano no longer stood untouched. The lady often asked her to play in the evenings. The family would gather, and the sound of her music filled the room like soft light. Even the children, who once saw her only as the maid, now looked at her with admiration. Sometimes, late at night, after everyone went to bed, she would sit alone at the piano again. She would play softly just for herself. The notes would echo gently through the house, wrapping her in peace. One night, after finishing a song, she sat quietly for a while, her fingers resting on the keys. She thought about how far she had come, from hiding her talent in silence to sharing it with the world. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. She whispered to herself, "Maybe this is what I was meant to do all along." The moonlight touched her face through the window, and the piano gleamed softly in its glow. She smiled and played one last tune before going to bed, a tune that spoke of second chances, kindness, and the quiet power of believing in oneself. The laughter that once made her feel small had now turned into applause. and in her heart she knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. The following weeks brought quiet but meaningful changes in her life. The night of the performance had become a small but unforgettable story in the town. People still talked about the maid who sat at the piano and made everyone cry with her music. Some said she had a gift from heaven, while others simply said she had a heart that spoke through sound. But for her, life went on much the same way. She still woke early to sweep the floors, wash the dishes, and cook meals. She didn't mind. Those things were part of who she was. Yet something inside her had awakened, a feeling she hadn't known for many years. Every morning she would hum softly while working. The house seemed warmer now, as if the piano's music had spread its calmness through every corner. The family noticed it too. The lady would sometimes pause whatever she was doing just to listen when the maid began to play in the evenings. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the house. It was addressed to the lady but mentioned the maid's name inside. The lady called her over, smiling as she read it aloud. "It's from the local music school," she said. "They heard about your performance at the charity event. They want to invite you to visit, maybe even teach a little." The maid froze, unsure how to respond. "Teach me?" she said softly, almost laughing. "I don't even have proper clothes to go there." The lady shook her head gently. "Clothes don't matter. They want your heart, not your appearance." She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity slowly replaced her fear. "Maybe I could go once," she whispered. That weekend they went together. The music school was small but full of life. Children's laughter and the sound of instruments filled the halls. When the head of the school met her, he greeted her kindly. "We don't meet people like you every day," he said. "You play with feeling, not just skill. That's what these children need to see." They led her to a classroom with an old piano. A few children were already waiting, their faces full of excitement. She sat down feeling nervous, her fingers trembling slightly. But the moment she touched the keys, everything felt right again. She began to play the same song she had performed at the event. The children watched quietly, their eyes wide. When she finished, one small girl clapped and said, "It sounds like the piano is telling a story." The maid smiled gently. "That's because music always tells a story," she said. "You just have to listen with your heart." That day, something changed again inside her. She realized she didn't need to dream of big stages or crowds. Teaching these children, helping them find their own voices, that was enough to make her feel alive. She began to visit the school every week. Sometimes she would teach simple lessons, and sometimes she would just play for them while they drew pictures or sang along. The children adored her. They would run to greet her whenever she arrived, calling her Miss Piano with joy. At home, the family was proud of her. The lady often told guests about her story, not to show off, but to remind people that everyone has hidden talents. "You never know what someone carries inside them," she would say. "Sometimes all they need is a little kindness to let it shine." Months passed, and the maid's life became more peaceful. She earned a small amount from the music school, enough to help her family in the village. She still worked in the house, but now her days were full of meaning. Every weekend, she would take a small walk by the lake nearby. She said it helped her think. One evening, while sitting there, she met an elderly man who often played a violin by the water. He was kind and quiet, and they soon became friends. He told her he had once been a music teacher too, but had stopped after losing his wife. "Music didn't sound the same anymore," he said softly. She looked at him and smiled. "Maybe music changes because we change, but it never leaves us completely." He nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it just waits for us to come back." Sometimes they would sit together in silence, playing soft tunes that blended with the sound of the wind and water. Those moments became special to her. She didn't know if the world would ever remember her name, but she felt content knowing that her music had found a place again, in hearts, not in fame. One evening, the lady of the house organized another small event. This time, she called it the Evening of Hidden Talents. It wasn't grand, just a gathering of neighbors and friends. The maid helped set up chairs and decorations, not expecting anything more. But as the evening went on, the lady stood up and said, "There's someone in this room who reminds me what it means to never give up on your dreams." She looked toward the maid and smiled warmly. "Would you play something for us again?" The maid blushed, shaking her head slightly. "Oh no, please, not me." But the people began to clap and cheer gently, encouraging her. Finally, she laughed softly and agreed. She sat at the piano once more. This time she didn't plan what to play. She just closed her eyes and began to create something new, a melody that felt like sunlight after rain. It was simple, pure, and full of hope. The room grew still, every person lost in the beauty of it. When she finished, the applause was long and heartfelt. But what touched her most was the look on people's faces, the warmth, the peace, the understanding. After everyone left, the lady hugged her tightly. "You've changed this house," she whispered. "You've changed me." The maid smiled softly. "Maybe music doesn't just heal those who listen," she said. "Maybe it heals those who play it too." That night she walked to her small room and looked out the window. The stars were shining brightly and she could hear the faint sound of crickets outside. She sat down by the window, resting her head against the wall, feeling peaceful. She thought about everything that had happened, the laughter that once hurt her, the fear that almost stopped her, and the courage that finally carried her forward. Life had not been easy, but it had led her here, to a place where her heart could finally speak. Before sleeping, she whispered, "Thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself for giving her a second chance." And somewhere in that quiet night, as the wind brushed through the trees, it almost felt like the piano answered back, humming softly as if it too was saying thank you. From that day on, the house never went a day without music. Sometimes it was soft and slow, other times bright and lively. But no matter what she played, it carried the same truth. The story of a woman who found her strength, her voice, and her peace through the keys of an old piano. The laughter that once surrounded her no longer echoed with mockery. Now it was full of joy, respect, and love. And as the days turned into years, the Maid's music lived on, not in concert halls or recordings, but in the hearts of all who had ever heard her play. She had once been the maid everyone laughed at, but now she was the melody no one could forget.